Backwards, actually. We did the last two stories in the book of Shoftim, which is Pesel Micha and Pilegesh Begiva, because those are actually very, very early. And now we're going to go backwards and go over the Shoftim. Some of this will be relatively quick. Perhaps, B'siyata Dishmaya, we can finish Shoftim. That would be nice to finish before the end of this month, and then we continue with the book of Shmuel and Elul and the like. Again, let me remind you that there are 13 Shoftim besides Yehoshua, meaning counting from Othniel ben Kenaz, who is the first Shofet, through Eli HaKohen is considered to be the last Shofet. It's a little uncertain because Shmuel is after Eli, so part of Shmuel's time he was the Shofet, and part there was a Melech, there was Shaul HaMelech. So Shmuel is a bit of a transitional figure, but not counting Shmuel and not counting Yehoshua, we have 13 Shoftim. And if you have a good liturgical memory in Slichos at various points, it actually refers to the 13 Shoftim. You'll now that you know it, you'll notice it when you see it next time. So there are 13 Shoftim, and if you include Yehoshua, the years are 383 years. Okay, so from Yehoshua till the death of Eli HaKohen is 383 years. For all of that time, the Mishkan was in Shiloh. Well, I'm sorry. The first 14 years of Yehoshua, it was in Gilgal, but from after 14 years, from Yehoshua and all the Shoftim, it was in Shiloh. It's called Mishkan Shiloh. Mishkan Shiloh is a full-service Beis HaMikdash. Everything you can bring in the Beis HaMikdash, you can bring in Mishkan Shiloh. And Mishkan Shiloh, you'll remember, is located in the territory of Ephraim. And that was the Makam of the Avodah. Now, what's interesting is, of this 383-year period, if you look at the book of Shoftim, you will actually find that more than 70 years we were under foreign occupation. 70 years, that's almost 20% of the time, we were under foreign occupation. We did not have our own state, so to speak. So let me just enumerate. Right after Yeshua's death, we were dominated by a king from Aram Naharayim, a king from Syria. That's the place of Lavan. And his name was Kushan Rishasayim. Now, it can't be an accident, although Rishasayim happened to be his name, but it has the same letters as Russia, so there's certainly a connection there. So we have 8 years of Kushan Rishasayim, right after the death of Yehoshua. And remember, according to Seder HaOlam, it is during those 8 years that Pesel Micha and Pilegesh Begiva happened. During those 8 years. Then Othniel ben Kenaz becomes the first Shofet, and his whole tenure was 40 years, but 8 of those years were Kushan Rishasayim, so as leader, he only had 32 years. Now remember, just without going over everything we went over already, Othniel ben Kenaz is Kalev's half-brother. Kalev is ben Yefunah, his father is Yefunah. When Yefunah died, his mother married a fellow named Kenaz, and Othniel is born from Kalev's mother and Kenaz. So Othniel is Kalev's younger half-brother, and you'll also remember he married his niece. Othniel ben Kenaz married Kalev's daughter. Now, after Othniel ben Kenaz, there's an 18-year stretch where we are ruled by Moav. So here we have to give a little background here. Both Ammon and Moav are the children of Lot, right? Remember, after Sodom was destroyed, so what happened was that Lot escaped with his 2 daughters, and his 2 daughters, who acted l'shem shemayim actually, saw a destroyed world, and they thought they were the last human beings. And the older daughter got her father drunk and had relations with him, had a child that she eventually named Moav. which comes from my father. The next night, the other daughter got load drunk, and he was with his daughter, second daughter again, and there was a child eventually that was called Ammon, from my people, Ammon. And these two boys became the founders of nations, Ammon and Moav. Now, where is Ammon and Moav located? They're located east of the Yarden, right? They're east of the Jordan River, around the Dead Sea area. Okay, that's the land of Moab and Ammon. Now, there are some interesting things we know about Moab and Ammon. Number one, when we wanted to go through their lands in order to get to Eretz Yisrael, instead of going all the way around, so we offered to pay them, etc., and they refused. And the Torah says, do not wage war with Ammon and Moav, because Ammon and Moav are the Bnei Lot, and I gave them their inheritance. So we are not allowed to wage wars of aggression against Ammon and Moav. Now, if they attack us, as we're going to see right now, we are allowed to fight back. That's for sure. But we're not allowed to engage in a war of aggression against Ammon and Moav, because their territory was given to Bnei Lot, and it's theirs. I think I mentioned before that Rav Moshe Feinstein used to tell a story on Purim that when he was a Rav in Russia, there was a certain man who was mezalzel in Lot's daughters. He talked about, what type of prostitutes they were, that they engaged in incest with their father. And after one of his diatribes against Lot's daughters, he has a dream at night in which two elderly women who look like angels, their faces are shining with the light of the Shekhinah, come to him in a dream. And he says, who are you? And he says, we're Lot's daughters. And the fact that you are mezalzel in our kavod is a very, very serious avera, because our kavana was totally l'shem shamayim. And because of this, the person suffered a very horrible death, like epileptic seizures in which he choked on his tongue. And Rav Moshe Feinstein used to say that, we have to realize that even things that look like sins are sometimes very, very great mitzvahs. And it's interesting that the other thing we know about Ammon and Moab, which we discussed when we read Megillas Rus, is that the Torah says that at least a male Ammonite or Moabite convert, he's a ger, he or she is a ger, but they cannot marry into Klal Yisrael. Now, females can. A female Moabite like Rus could marry into Klal Yisrael, but a male Moabite convert cannot marry into Klal Yisrael. And this is in Parshas Ki Seitzei, Lo Yavo Ammoni U'Moavi B'Kal Hashem. And the Torah gives a reason. The Torah actually gives two reasons. The Torah does not say because they came out of incest. First of all, if that would have been the reason, there would be no nafkamina between male and female anyway. And that's not the reason, because they acted l'shem shamayim. The incest is absolutely not the reason the Torah gives. The Torah gives as a reason, number one, they did not give you food and water when you were traveling in the desert. So they were selfish and ungrateful for what Avram did for Lot. And number two, the Moabites in particular hired Bilam to curse you. And then it goes on and says, and just as we know, Hashem did not allow Bilam to curse, and Hashem turned Bilam's curse into a blessing. But because they tried to curse you, they're not worthy of becoming members of the Jewish people. So our attitude towards Ammon and Moav is kind of a standoffish attitude. We don't wage war with them, but we also don't let them enter into Klal Yisrael unless it's a female, because as it says, females were not expected to give food and water to a strange nation and the like. Right? So this is what we know about Ammon and Moav. Now, in spite of the fact that we're not allowed to wage war against... Oh yeah, one other thing I want to mention, the Gemara in Gittin. Now, remember that 2.5 tribes lived east of the Yarden River. The 2.5 tribes are Reuven, Gad, and half, actually it's not half, but a portion of the tribe of Menashe. Menashe, part of it was on west, Eretz Yisrael proper, part of it was Eivor Yarden. Now, the land that we conquered, Eivor Yarden, that was settled by Reuven, Gad, and Chazi Shevet Menashe, from whom was that land conquered? It was not conquered from Moav and Ammon, they were south. Rather, we waged war against Sichon, who was an Amorite king, he was a Canaanite king, and we waged war against Og, Melech HaBashan, where the Golan Heights are. Okay, so the land of the 2.5 tribes is the land of Sichon and Og. And the southern boundary of that is the river Arnon, which is a river that comes out of it flows into the Dead Sea. Right, so Arnon is the boundary between the land of Sichon, which is north of Arnon, and the land of Moab and Ammon, which is south of Arnon. So that's why the Torah makes the point, we took the land up until, going from north to south, up until the river Arnon. We did not go beyond the river Arnon, because that was the land of Moab, which we were not allowed to conquer. Now, but the Chumash says, actually it was in last week's Parsha, that in reality, original Moabite territory was much larger than it was. Moabite territory extended north of Arnon, but Sichon had waged war against Moab and conquered that territory. Meaning, at least part of the land of Sichon was originally Moabite territory. Right? So, how were we allowed to take the land of Sichon if we're not supposed to wage war against the land of Moab? So the Gemara enunciates a very important principle. Ammon uMoav tiharu b'Sichon. What does that mean? The land of Ammon and Moab became purified, became kashered through the conquest of Sichon. You hear what this means? Meaning, once Sichon had conquered that land, it was no longer Moabite territory, even though it originally was. Once it was no longer Moabite territory, we are given permission to conquer it. You see? So we couldn't go south of the river Arnon because that was still Moabite territory and that was given to Bnei Lot. But once another country conquered it, even if it was unlawful, b'di'evet it became their property. In fact, this is the source of the idea that halacha recognizes a notion of kinyan, acquisition of ownership by conquest. It's an interesting notion. The question is, does that even apply if it's a war of aggression? I mean, did Sichon have any halachic right? We don't even know why Sichon waged war against Moab. Sichon just waged war against Moab. And yet, fascinatingly enough, the ownership of Sichon is recognized ad kedei kach that the Jewish people are allowed to conquer that Moabite territory based on the principle Ammon and Moab. In other words, Sichon conquered both Ammonite and Moabite territory north of Arnon, that whatever was conquered by Sichon now became mutter to Bnei Yisrael. By the way, they say by Megillas Esther a very, very similar vort. If you remember, it says that when Haman was killed, so Achashverosh gave, besides giving Mordechai the authority to be prime minister, but it says base Haman, all of Haman's wealth was given to Mordechai. Now the kasha is, they ask the kasha. The kasha is Haman is from Amalek. Haman Ha'agagi. Haman is descended from the king of Amalek that Shaul was supposed to kill. And Shaul did not kill, so Shmuel eventually killed Agag. But what happened was, in the meantime, Agag impregnated a woman, and that woman was the ancestor of Haman. That's why he's called Haman Ha'agagi. Now with Amalek, not only is there a mitzvah to kill Amalek, but there's also a mitzvah to destroy their property. Right? You remember, in other words, Shaul HaMelech was commanded to destroy the animals, destroy everything. So how was Mordechai allowed to take possession of Haman's property? It was the shalal, it was the spoils of Amalek. Haman is Amalek. You have to destroy the spoils of Amalek. So one of the answers that's given is this. There's a general rule in halacha that even applies to umos ha'olam, that if a person is killed because they commit an aveira, you're machal Shabbos, there's no forfeiture of property. Your property is inherited by your son. But if you are killed because of rebellion against the king, there's actually a forfeiture of property. Your property goes to the king. Right? Haruge Beistin Nichseim Liyorshim. Haruge Malchus Nichseim Lamelech. Now, Haman was actually executed. Why did Achashverosh kill Haman? It's not because he loved the Jewish people in particular, but once he understood that Haman was plotting even against the queen, because Esther was Jewish, so that was considered an act of treason. So Haman was killed as a mored b'malchus. So, haruge malchus nichseim lamelech. When Haman got killed, Achashverosh automatically acquired ownership of the property. When Mordechai took over Haman's property, he was not getting the property from Haman. He was getting the property from Achashverosh. And it's meduyik in the pasuk. That's why the pasuk says Achashverosh gave Beis Haman. So some Mefarshim say the same answer that Ammon and Moav get purified b'sichain. Amalek property can be laundered if it gets first acquired by another non-Jew. And you can then get it from that non-Jew. It wouldn't work if a Jew, I can't buy Amalek property from a Jew because the first Jew has to destroy it. But remember, Achashverosh is under no mitzvah to destroy Amalek's property. So Achashverosh acquired ownership. Mordechai got it from Achashverosh. In other words, it's mamish an application of the principle Ammon u'Moav kiharu b'sichain. I know it sounds like money laundering, but within the halachic parameters, this can actually work. Okay, so that is why we were able. Now, if you followed last week's Haftarah, which is actually in the book of Shoftim, and we're going to get to him. Yitzchak, who is a later judge, we're not going to look at so much today, was actually confronted with a Moabite claim to the land east of the Jordan by saying, hey, you Jews have no right to this land. This land belonged to us. And if you remember, Yitzchak essentially reiterated all of these ideas that we did not take the land from you, we took the land from Sichon, who took it from you. And once Sichon got the land, it's his land, not your land, and therefore you no longer have a legitimate claim. It's actually in the book of Shoftim, based on everything that we talked about. Okay. So that's kind of a little bit of background about Moav, Ammon and Moav, east of the Jordan. South of the river Arnon. Again, Arnon is just a big stream that flows into the Dead Sea. Right? So if you can picture the Dead Sea, Arnon is right in the middle of it. Right? Even today, look in a map, Arnon right? Goes into the Dead Sea. Okay. Now, what happened was, after Othniel died, however, is that Moav became aggressive. And for 18 years, Moav, east of the Jordan, ruled over Eretz Yisrael. Now, what's interesting is we're not given any record of the war, meaning we're not told how did Moav wage war, how did they conquer us, how long did it take, what were the casualties. We're just given a statement. It's a naked statement that Moav ruled over Eretz Yisrael for 18 years. I mean, there's a lot of information there that you're bichlal not given. But at the end of the 18 years, we are told that a hero arose whose name was Ehud ben Gera. And he, by the way, has the longest tenure of any shofet, 62 years. And Ehud ben Gera liberated Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael from the rule of Moav. So Moav remained a nation east of the Jordan, but this was a war of independence. And we are given a particular story. It's a well-known story that Ehud requested a meeting with Eglon, and he comes to Eglon's palace, which is like a summer palace, open with windows. That was ancient world air conditioning, basically just meant you had wide open windows. And Eglon was by himself. And it's interesting that the Navi makes a point, and why is this important? It actually is important, that, oh, by the way, Ehud was left-handed. Like, who cares? Actually, it turns out to be very important because you wear your sword on the opposite side of your dominant hand, right? If I use my right hand, I don't put my sword here. It's hard to take out a sword that's on your right side with your right hand. I put my sword here. So since Ehud was a lefty, right, he put his sword on his right thigh. So apparently, Eglon's security guards were not too smart. And whenever somebody came in, they always did a weapon search, right? They only searched on the left. They didn't search on the right. And apparently, Ehud ben Gera knew that ahead of time. Again, it's kind of crazy. I think security procedures have improved, at least in that sense. Although for TSA, maybe not actually, but certainly halal security has greatly improved. So Ehud is wearing a sword concealed under his tunic on his right thigh, and they didn't notice that. So that's why the fact that he's a lefty is important, actually. And he goes to Eglon, and he's all alone in the room, private audience. And he says to Eglon, I have a message from Hashem. And Eglon gets up, and he takes 3 steps forward. Chazal say that's a great, great zechus for him. In fact, we'll see his children are Rus and Orpah. Those are his daughters. But as he steps forward, Ehud takes his sword. Eglon is described as corpulent, very heavy, fat guy. Maybe that's why the 3 steps were considered an extra merit, because it may have been harder. That may have been harder for him too. In a kind of a very vivid picture, the sword is going through his entire stomach, ad kidei kach, that even the top of the sword like disappears in there. There's so much there that it all goes in. Eglon drops dead, and the doors were closed, so he just leaves very quickly, and the guards don't know. The guards don't know whether they come in because the door is closed, and they figure, well, maybe he's going to the bathroom, maybe he's relieving himself, and we shouldn't interrupt. Eventually, they do come in, and they find that he is dead. Now, of course, that's not the end of the war. Just because you kill the king doesn't mean that the rulership terminated, but as a result, Ehud then organized a military campaign, and because the Moabites were demoralized, they lost their king, so eventually the Pasuk describes that he was able to liberate Eretz Yisrael. Now again, we're not told over how long a time. We're just not given a lot of details about these particular wars. It didn't take a day. It must have taken longer than a day. But eventually, it does give us the story of the killing of Eglon, Melech Moav, and Ehud ben Gera liberating Eretz Yisrael. And then there's always a machlokes. When we say Ehud was a shofet for 62 years, are you including the 18 years? Just like with Othniel. With Othniel, when we say Othniel ben Kenaz was a shofet for 40 years, that's including the 8 years of Kushan Rishasayim in terms of the cheshbon, or at least that's a machlokes. Is it 8 years and then 40, or 8 years and 32? You have a similar machlokes with Ehud ben Gera. Was it 18 Eglon and 62 of Ehud after that? Or is it 18 and then it's 62 minus 18? Okay, that's a big machlokes. I'll tell you, let me explain why there's a machlokes. I mean, I don't want to get into all the technicalities. But, we got this big problem. And that is, we calculate a certain number of years from the time of Yoshua to the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. But if you add up, it's 850 years. But if you add up all of these years, including the kings later, you get a longer period. So one of the Teirutzim, one of the Mahalchim Meforshim have is that they collapse the years by saying, for example, well, when it says Othniel was a shofet for 40, it really means 32 because you count Kushan Rishasayim. And when it says Ehud ben Gera was a shofet for 62 years, you subtract 18 because of the 18 of Eglon. In other words, this is a parshanus, this is an interpretation designed to keep you down to the 850. Otherwise, you would have more than the 850 years, and that creates a stira to Chazal. So although Chazal do not explain this explicitly, but this is what many Meforshim say. I don't want to get into all of the details, but that's why you're going to have a machlokas here. Now, as I indicated, and I think I mentioned it when we learned Rus as well, Eglon did have two daughters, before he was killed, obviously, Rus and Orpah. And we know, of course, that Rus eventually converted to Judaism, and Rus the Moabite became the great-grandmother of David HaMelech. Right? Rus and Boaz had a son, Oved. Oved had a son, Yishai. Yishai had a son, David. And that actually means that Moshiach is descended from Rus the Moabite. And therefore, indirectly, descended from Eglon Melech Moav. So Eglon Melech Moav has some big zechus here, that essentially Malchus Yisrael and even Mashiach comes from Eglon Melech Moav. Why would such a degenerate Russia be zocha to such a zechus? So Chazal say it was in the merit of the 3 steps that he took to honor Hashem. Again, as I say, maybe for him the 3 steps were a big deal, but Pashtus, it wasn't a tremendous deal. So we see the tremendous reward Hashem can give for even the most relatively insignificant action. The Chovos HaLevavos writes that in Ruchnius there is no such thing as a Maaseh Tov that is so insignificant that it doesn't count. The smallest thing counts a lot. Now, this is an important mussar for people to be aware of, because it reminds a person that even if I'm not doing something completely well, even the little bit that I do can count. I can tell a guy, for example, who's not even keeping Shabbos yet. Okay? But before you go to the party, whatever it is, you can say Kiddush. He's going to say, well, does my Kiddush count for anything if I'm going to be Machal Shabbos right afterwards? The answer is, yeah. Your Kiddush counts for something. They tell a story with the Vilna Gaon, an interesting thing. In other words, we sometimes make the mistake that if I'm not doing the big things, then why should I bother with the smaller things? How could they matter? So they tell the story with the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon, at one point in his life, went into Gullus. He wandered around in his 30s. He wandered around for kapara and the like, and there are all sorts of stories. He was actually anonymous, and he solved mathematical problems in universities. Many different legends about the Vilna Gaon's Gullus, it was called. But at some point in his Gullus, he was put in prison, because in those days in Europe, even if you went from city to city in the same country, you had to have identification papers. Like you couldn't go from Frankfurt to Hamburg without, documentation. So he didn't have all of his documents. So he was arrested. He was thrown into prison. And he was sharing a cell with a Jewish guy who was there for murder, which is uncommon, right? Jews may commit crimes, but they tend not to be violent crimes. Although we have our exceptions, Mayor Lansky, we have Jewish mafia too, but generally speaking, Jews are more into white-collar crime. But okay, this guy was a murderer. So they brought them water and bread. Apparently the Gra knew it was kosher, he was going to eat the bread. But the Gra took the water and was doing Netilas Yadayim. And this guy was eating the bread without Netilas Yadayim. So the Gra said to him, Rabbi Yed, what about Netilas Yadayim? You got to wash your hands. How can you eat bread without Netilas Yadayim? So the guy started laughing. He says, he was a big burly guy. Yeah. He says, these hands have broken necks, have murdered people. You think Hashem cares if a murderer washes his hands before bread? I've done a lot worse things with my hands than not washing them. And the Gra said to him, what does one have to do with the other? Yeah, you're a murderer. That's pretty bad. There's going to be a big din v'cheshbon on murder. But do you think you're off the hook for not doing Netilas Yadayim? Kam le b'draba mineh, like we say, the bigger punishment cancels. You think that because you murdered, you're putter from washing your hands? Two different things. You'll be nenash for murder. You'll get rewarded for Netilas Yadayim, he says. And this is a very important idea, that whatever good you do counts. And it's not canceled out. In fact, the Rambam says in Pirkei Avos, that a person shouldn't think, if I do 1,000 mitzvahs and 1,000 averos, the averos and the mitzvahs cancel each other out and I'm zero. It doesn't work that way. These are two separate ledgers. It is recorded that you will get reward for 1,000 mitzvahs. And it is recorded that you will get punished for 1,000 averos. These are separate cheshbonos. The mitzvah does not take away the avera, and the avera does not take away the mitzvah. Now, that's actually a very good deal. And the reason why that is a good deal is, on one hand, it does mean that your mitzvahs don't take away your averas, so maybe that sounds bad. But remember, the punishment for an avera is limited in duration. For an avera, you can go to Gehenna, but no more than 12 months, by and large. Once you get rewarded for your mitzvahs, that's forever. Remember, Olam Haba is forever. Gehenna is not forever. So, by saying that your mitzvahs remain, even if you have so many averas, that's actually a good benefit for you. The mitzvahs remain for eternal reward. This is what the Rambam says. So therefore, if there are two different cheshbonos, a person should never stop from doing whatever mitzvah they can do, in spite of all of the big averos that they have, because the mitzvah is still going to count. And once again, going back to the text here, we see this from Eglon Melech Moav. Eglon Melech Moav was obviously not a righteous person. He was an Oved Avodah Zarah at a minimum, and obviously he was oppressing Am Yisrael. We don't know exactly what he did, but not so good. And yet, in the merit of him taking 3 steps in honor of God, we don't even know why he was motivated to take those 3 steps at that particular point. He was Zocheh, that Rus HaMoaviyah, the ancestor of Mashiach, comes from him, right? So this is an important musar that we can learn. And at that point, Ehud ben Gera then liberated Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael, And it mentions he was a shofet for 62 years. Again, machlokas, if that includes the 18 of Moav or is separate. But then, strangely enough, right after Ehud ben Gera's long reign, we are under the domination of a Canaanite king, the king of Chatzor, whose general is the infamous Sisera. And that's foreign domination for 20 years. I mean, this is pretty amazing. Right after Yoshua dies, 8 years under Kushan Rishasayim. Right after Othniel dies, it's only one shofet at a time. 18 years of Eglon Melech Moav. Right after Ehud ben Gera dies, after a very long period, we have, 20 years. Actually, Sisera's not the king, Sisera's the general, but it's Yavin, under King Yavin. But we know that this is a case where we know the general more than the king. Sisera actually plays a more important role in the narrative than the king. So far, it's just one. One judge, foreign domination. One judge, foreign domination. One judge, foreign domination. Now we will see there'll be other periods of foreign domination where you may have had 3 or 4 shoftim until it happens. But it's a recurring pattern that happens over and over and over again. And once we get into Sisera, we of course get into the story of Devorah. Okay, so that's what we'll do tomorrow. Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.